So, if you've got a question on your mind, could you raise your hand, please?
Okay. Well, it's my name is Clyde Ellsworth. Sorry,
right.
My name is Clyde Ellsworth. I'm going to be doing one of the workshops this afternoon. I could so easily make a statement that you want a question, don't you? So, what would be useful to me? Do you know people in the BBC who are open to suggestions?
Okay, thank you. Okay,
or any news channel.
Okay, lady over here.
Yeah, my name's Maura. I would love to hear the 5 things in psychiatry you could do without. I don't know if you, that's how you said it, but when you consider it, I'd be very interested.
Okay, and a third question, Hetty.
Hetty Isaac. Very, very interesting and really nice variety of talks, lots of comments. But my question is it a contradiction in terms, psychologists and positive messages around climate change? And how would each of the speakers suggest that psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists move into the space of positive messages in the same way, the parallel with health, or rather the illness business, moving into public health, which was pretty much an entirely positive message, pumps at every corner of fresh water.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got 3 questions, panel. From Clive, other people, what are the channels, who's open in the BBC to these things? The 5 things that psychiatry could do without, which I think is fulfill, and to all of you, the question of psychology and positive messages, how to move into that space. So let's take some responses.
So shall I start with the BBC question? I think that's probably directed at me to a degree.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things I would say about the BBC is that the BBC has been incredibly disappointing on climate change. That's one of the things I was talking about when I went to the Westminster Select Committee. And I think one of the problems that the BBC has is that almost more than any other press organisation or news outlet, it sticks to its elite sourcing. It follows what the politicians are saying. It reports on the speeches of government, it reports on the announcements of government. Government aren't talking about climate change. It tends to be the case that the BBC don't talk much about climate change either. As you probably know, in recent years, they've cut the number of science correspondents, so they're very limited as well. I find if you look at, I always think with climate change, one of the key things that communicators should do is connect with stories and issues which relate to people's lives directly, so flooding potentially, the 3rd runway at Heathrow. Do you know the BBC reported the story about the 3rd run at Heathrow and didn't mention climate change once? Yeah. So I'd love to say that I know people who feel the way we feel, and I know they do exist, but the structures of the BBC at the moment have not allowed them to report climate change in a positive way. I think their obsessive concern with bias has led to the balances bias with the sceptics. It's created the space for them to emerge. I'd love to give a more positive message. I know people at the BBC are concerned with climate change, particularly the science correspondents. I'm not saying they're dismissive of it, but the structures are in place in a way that actually makes it very difficult for them to have led on climate change. I really think it's desperately disappointing. Of course, we can work with very good journalists. I mean, Richard Black, who was supposed to be here today, is an ex-BBC journalist, and he works with journalists at the BBC all the time. But all I can really say is I think it's been incredibly disappointing. Individuals are quite limited in what they can do. I think it's the structures that are in place. Of course, I'm going to say that because I'm a sociologist, but I think the degree of agency that individual journalists have is limited, and I think in climate change it's shown, I don't know, the weaknesses of the BBC, much as we love it. I'd love to say something more positive, but those are my feelings on it.
Thank you. Shall we take a response to the question of what were the 5 things that psychiatry could do without, Phil?
Yeah, just to follow on the BBC question, because I think that I still read The Guardian every day, but they're not as climate friendly as they used to be, and I wonder if it was because the last editor left. But then you realise if you're only reading The Guardian, you're getting biased messages as well. But I don't know that's happened for me. It's just less of an emphasis on climate change. My question is, what are the 5 things? The truth is I can't remember because they haven't been published yet and there's been a little bit of delay, but there's nothing secret about telling you. I can remember 4 of them off the top of my head.
Thank you.
But they come in a sense that we're trying to stop waste. So they are, I think 4 I can remember off the top of my head, but for example, chronic schizophrenia is treated with an injection. And you only need to have that once a month, and a lot of doctors give it every 2 weeks, and that's a waste. It's not good for the patients, it's not good for medicines. That's one. Antidepressants, if they're not working, you need to go back and review with your doctor. Maybe they're not for you, but patients get stuck on antidepressants for ages and ages. That's the second one. There is a recommendation about sodium valproate, which is a treatment for bipolar disorder, and not giving it for women because it's of childbearing age, because it's going to have to be changed, and you get into difficulties over the change. That's a third one. There's a fourth one about antipsychotics being used for dementia as a sedative, and that isn't helpful. And that's really, they can occasionally be helpful, but it's a very useful generalisation. And if the next one comes to me, I'll let you know what it is. There's a fifth as well. They're not actually being published by any. Actually, that's not true. I think they have now been published. So we could I might be able to find it on the internet.
Thank you.
Okay. So the last question was to everybody. Andrew, you look like you're raring to go.
Yeah, well, I always like Hetty's questions. I mean, I did say very clearly that I distrust psychotherapists and psychoanalysts when they move into this area, but not for the reason that you gave about positive and negative and so on. After all, the great skill of psychotherapists is to take something that looks negative and turn it to the positive, finding the gold in the shadow, if you like. And that's really what my paper was doing, taking something like coffee drinking, perfume, fashion, and seeing how these things can be spun towards a positive statement in relation to something like climate change or sacrifice, which feels very negative. At the same time, one can talk about sacrifice positively, and it's something that psychotherapists of all schools do. So what I said about apocalypse is more difficult, and I won't even go into that now, but I think it's that has to be considered as a possible role for psychotherapists, to take the negative, as you put it, I'm using your terms, and to see that buried in the negative is something positive. And of course, to be quite honest, buried in the positive that's buried in the negative is something that again is negative. But that degree of complexity doesn't worry us too much because we'll all be dead.
Okay, would anybody else like to chip in on that one?
I was just thinking what I might add. I'm not sure that I accept a division between sociology, psychology, and so on. I don't mean to blur disciplinary boundaries, but one thing I found with climate work is that it gets you thinking in very different ways, and these boundaries. So I don't think you need to be defensive about being a sociologist or me being a psychoanalyst. I think that what this work has shown me, my discipline background and the day job is with individuals, okay, and their psychological states. But what I've learned is that I find the patterns of those psychological states in groups. And I think this is quite profound, actually. So anyway, so I don't really accept the question about psychology. Now, as such, you know, I think it's more complicated. Now, when it comes to giving negative messages, I think we're in a culture that, as I said in the talk I gave, that I think protects us from difficult truths. Climate Psychology Alliance is called Facing Difficult Truths. Okay, so that there's also a cultural aspect to this, the very question that we don't want the negative. Okay, actually I think what we want is the truth, and sometimes the truth, we want the truth more than anything. Bion, who was a psychoanalyst, put it that too little truth makes you unwell, you know. as you were outlining, it causes these focus groups terrible confusion. You know, the media has left us horribly confused, and it's traumatic to be that confused, actually, to rely, to look out for someone you can trust and so on. So I think that the more we can understand our social world, our political world, the better equipped and the more positive we can be in combating it. And so I think we need as much understanding as we can get, and I'm unapologetic about that. And we need psychological understanding as well, because I think that's been too thin on the ground so far in the climate area. Mm-hmm. I wanted to say one other thing, which is that, I thought you gave a hopeful picture as well as the problematic picture that you gave. You see, we have been bombarded with confusion by the media and by political forces. But I think actually people, you can't fool all the people all the time. People are seeing the corruption in the system. They are much, much more sus. That person who's saying, I can't find news, to me, that uplifts me, because that person knows there's a problem. And so, far from people being stupid, I think they are very sussed, as well as being very manipulated, and I take great heart from that. And the more we can understand these processes of corruption, collusion, and so on, the better. The more we can understand the perversity in our culture and in this economic system and the culture it generates, the better. So those are my sources of optimism. Well, you wanted to ask, a bit long-winded, sorry.
I have two quick things. When I and my colleagues managed to get our college interested, we had to get past the sort of negativeness of the college, who said we are there to treat patients who've got mental illness. We're not there to get involved in prevention, patient empowerment, public health sort of issues. That's not really our bag. So, but we did change, and that was very positive. So college is now fully on board. And to be precise, I've now got the 5 things. So it is antidepressants for 2 months, and you should think about a change. Actually, I misquoted the long-term, the depot issue. They should be considered, because the evidence is better for long-term injections. The reason I mistook that is because we had quite a good study showing the waste of depots, patients not taking that correctly. I could add, this is worth mentioning, apologies for sticking with me again. It's the antipsychotics for young people and dementia, unless they've got a severe mental illness. Actually, so it's young people as well. The valproate one I got right, and the last one is we shouldn't routinely investigate psychosis with a CT or an MRI unless there's a very good reason for it, to cut down the waste of investigation.
Thank you very much. So we've got a whole load more hands. So we'll take the lady in red. Adrian, who's had his hand up for a while. Let's take somebody from over this side, the lady in black here. So have your questions quickly. We'll get the panel on to them.
A bit of outrage, really, and indignation that you're fiddling around with how much medication to give people when you could be just offering counselling to thousands and thousands of people. And it's like, what are you talking about? Cutting down it's just so tiny.
Okay.
With the shift that needs to happen.
Thank you. I think you made that point very passionately clear. Thank you. Adrian.
Yeah, Adrian King. On the same day this week, we had John Kerry from Marrakesh saying market forces rather than policy will ensure the transition to a low carbon world. And John Abraham in The Guardian about Trump's team. We're completely fucked. Is there a polarisation taking place? The sort of apocalyptic tendency that Andrew was referring to, and some kind of myth of progress.
Okay, thank you. And lady over here.
Question mainly for Catherine, but I think also from the psychology point of view, my question is, what messages should we be most trying to get over through the media, through social media and stuff? And I ask because in my research I found lack of agency, lack of hope is very important. And what distinguished people who rescued Jews during the Second War was that they felt a sense of agency. Oh, it wasn't anything, everybody would have done the same. It's like the trust that people will do this. And trust is being eroded in the public space, terribly destroyed. So what messages would you recommend?
Okay, thank you very much. So, Phil, that first one was for you. Are you fiddling with medication when you should be thinking about counselling?
Could you just tell me a bit more what your question is?
My question is, why isn't the School of Psychiatrists embracing the research that's been done about how beneficial counselling is for people with dementia, people with severe and chronic mental health problems? There is very little carbon waste in counselling.
Yes, okay, right. So firstly, we would be very supportive of counselling as well as medication. So patients with chronic psychotic illnesses have to have the medication. And we're often very supportive of psychological treatment. Unfortunately, we're not governing. I think you probably find documents from the college supporting that position. Is it how to get that into patients is probably the issue. Unfortunately, counselling is not as carbon efficient as you might think. Unfortunately, Dan did a study to show that certainly with CBT, that's not counselling, the CBT, the cost of the travel and the room and the building is actually quite considerable. I wouldn't want that to put us off, but it's more complex than we first realised. That's the issue.
A quick contribution to this discussion about the waste. I did a internship in a day hospital in Brazil, and I know that they have a lot of exchange here with the day hospital here in the UK too. And one very conservative psychiatrist told me that he had been having recurrent experiences of taking psychotics to the countryside, and he's completely surprised and astonished how the symptoms practically disappear from this psychotic, seriously psychotic patients that are under medication, current.
So it's becoming a bit me, is that right?
Just how this is being considered.
Well, we link with various natural spaces, green spaces groups, and that is coming into our work. I'm afraid I don't think it'll cure schizophrenia, but it will certainly help. So that is becoming part of our work as well.
Shall we move on to Adrian's question, panel, which I think was probably for all of you, which was about is there a polarisation between the idea that market forces will save us and we're all fucked? Does anybody feel inspired to respond to that?
I'll respond in a nutshell. Each of those excites us, but in a different way. That we can sort it out, the market and common sense and science will sort it out, especially if we change the message, which I've got some doubts about, because the other thing is also exciting. We want to be fucked. That's the point. Well, yes, if you take fuck literally, of course we all want to be fucked, but I'm talking about your use of it there, which is something about apocalypse. You're absolutely right. But on this message question, I am very uncomfortable with some of the language being generated from up here. I don't feel comfortable with people being referred to as ladies. I don't like the use of the word truth. What is truth?
Why not?
Because it's up for context. Who asked that?
Me.
Yeah.
Richard.
Sorry, Richard. Hello. No, I like your questions too. But because there's usually discussion. There's usually more than one approach to things.
Sure.
It's never as simple as the truth. And words like
so your objection is to the word "the" rather than the truth.
Yes, the truth. Yes. And then another word I didn't like was perversity. I spoke about the great danger in psychopathologizing anyone in the political sphere. And the word good, when applied to a leader, is also something to discuss. That's what I'm saying. Now, if we simply go in for certitudes, I think we will not get our message across. And the language, I mean, I know you've used most of them, but I don't think you're the only person that uses words like truth, perversity, and good. I think that language is hopeless. because people are full of doubts. And just telling them that there is a truth, that what they do and think and behave is perverse, and that they are ladies, I think it's not much use.
That's not what's being said.
Does anybody else on the panel want to respond to the questions which were about the polarisation of the 2 points of view and about what kind of messages should we be trying to get across and the issue of agency? And we've got some, Catherine.
Yeah, I'll respond to the question about agency and messaging, and I agree completely. I think you're absolutely right. I did, as I said, research in China and Brazil last year, and one of the things that struck me was the degree to which, actually awareness of climate change wasn't necessarily as high as it is here, but the degree to which people believed that individual action could make a difference. And when we gave them new information, they responded by saying, yes, I was looking at meat production in particular and sustainable diets. Participants often said, yes, I'll go away from what you've said, and we can all make a difference, we can actually make a difference. And I think in the US and the UK groups, people just didn't believe that individuals could make a difference. The sense that I think this is part of the neoliberal order as well. It's not just about, the kind of structural changes in the economic system. It's about the way it works on us as individuals and makes us feel that we're not part of a collective. We can't work together. Everything comes down to us. If we don't get a job, it's our fault. It's our individual fault. We think in terms of individuals, and we don't think we can work together to make change happen. And I think that's a really interesting point. I think in terms of messaging, it's very, very difficult, but actually there was some research done recently by an organisation called Climate Outreach. Adam Corner, I think he writes for The Guardian quite a lot, thought it was very interesting. They were looking at the images that were in circulation around the time of COP21, and they were trying to look at the impact of different images and how people responded, very similar to my own work actually. And funnily enough, one of the image that they found got the greatest response in terms of people saying, I will go and change my behaviour, was a very kind of ordinary image of a man insulating his loft. And I think one of the problems with the messaging on climate change and the expectation that people will go and change their behaviour in response to, reports that it's the hottest year on record, actually people need to be told what to do. Give them something very, very specific to do. Actually, that kind of simple messaging in terms of behavioural change, actually if you just tell them how dreadful climate change is, they'll think, well, God, what do I do? Give them something very specific to do that they can actually go and make a difference. I think it actually can work very, very well. In Scotland, there was a very powerful campaign about 10 years ago, not related to climate change, but you can see it any way you want, which was take the school walk, not the school run. I've got to say, I usually walk my son to school when I don't drive, but on the odd occasion when it's very bad weather and we do go in my husband's car, I think, oh, take the school run, we shouldn't have been doing this. It plays on my mind to this day. It was incredibly powerful. It was a simple, single thing I could do to make a difference for my son's health, or climate, or however you want to interpret it. So be specific about what you're asking people to do, because that's where people feel empowered. What can I do? Telling me how dreadful it is, I don't know how to respond. So, but I agree with the point about agency, absolutely. I think it's a problem in the West, actually, more broadly.
Okay, thank you very much. Shall we just take another...
Actually, I want to...
Sorry, Sally, carry on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I agree with Andrew that I think there's something exciting about both sides of your polarised statement, Adrian, of the two positions. Not surprisingly, I also agree with you about something called the truth. And I certainly wasn't meaning to convey something called the truth. That said, I do believe that some things are truer than other things. I believe what the scientists are saying about climate change has what's called scientific certainty. They're much less certain when it comes to modelling the effects and how it's going to play out. I do believe in that sort of truth as opposed to the lies of the Nigel Lawsons of this world. That's the kind of sphere that I'm operating in. I also, and I spent actually quite a long time in writing my thoughts for this paper, realised that actually I do have a position that social justice is a good thing. I'm not a relativist. And I also think that I can find strands within my own theoretical discipline, which is psychoanalysis, that would support that. There would be other analysts who, all persuasions, who would profoundly disagree with me about that. But I actually hold that as a position, and so I think it's a morally better position, and I state that. So, you know, if anyone disagrees with that, well then yes, we have a real disagreement. And I was quite taken with the psychoanalyst Hannah Siegel, who, this may not be quite the same point, but I think it's in the area, it gives one strength. When it was pointed out to her, but aren't psychoanalysts neutral, she said, well, I'm certainly not neutered. And, you know, and I found it helpful to myself to realise I'm not a relativist in terms of what I think is right and wrong and so on and so forth. So it's a highly problematic area, but I wanted to say I don't think we should be afraid to say that, you know, if we go down a fascist route, this is not a good thing, and that in fact it's an evil thing, and I don't mind saying that. I want to say one more thing and then I'll stop. About negative messaging. See, I think we're in a culture, and here's another thing I agree with you about, Andrew, is that you're talking about apocalyptic things. I think it comes in much smaller scale doses. It's like somebody makes an effort, and in our culture it's absolutely fine to say, yeah, but you know what, no big, etc. And what you suffer is a kind of, like it's like the life goes out of you. So I think we're at a time of enormous difficulty, and that I think we're moving on to, if you like, appreciating that war is being waged on us. Some of us step up and some won't. But I think it's got to the point where we need to apply that old war phrase, careless talk. I mean, talk without care. And it's very often oversimple. Of throwing a little analysis at something, it costs life. It costs the life that we need when we're already struggling against quite big forces. So that's what I think about it.
Thank you very much. Okay. Do we just very quickly take 3 more questions? We may not be able to get answers to all of them. Okay, so Laurie, and the gentleman behind you there, and the guy with the beard over here. I'm sorry, everybody else. Let's just hear your questions quickly.
Okay, today's about leadership. Can you name and perhaps explain a role model for the kind of leadership we need?
Thank you. Okay, next one.
Paul Matey. Andrew, you mentioned right at the beginning that something about what we're talking about here is transpersonal. And I just wondered if you could say something about that, and particularly the practical implications of taking it seriously.
Okay, thank you.
Steve Mandel. I'm an economist, and there's a thing in economics called Gresham's Law, where bad money drives out good. And I'm wondering how we counter the Gresham's Law of politics, where simplistic nostrums drive out sensible and balanced and nuanced messages.
Okay, thank you very much. We may not get to all of these, but can I just first ask all of you to, any of you can come up with a role model?
Just thinking about the recent context, I suppose, in terms of leadership, I'm very conflicted about the role of celebrities in raising awareness about different issues and how helpful they can be, because often I think it relates back to arguments about the very anti-elitist culture that we have at the moment. Often they're seen as a bit pompous, and often they see themselves as self-appointed spokespeople for particular issues, and actually it can often be counterproductive. In the final days, I think, of Hillary Clinton's campaign, I'm not convinced that bringing out celebrities helped her, actually, in terms of the debate as it was playing out. However, having said all that, I think DiCaprio plays it just right, and the reason I think he does is because, to me, he is very deferential to the scientists. He roots his arguments in, he sees himself, I think, more as a facilitator. He's raising awareness, but he hands over to the UN, he hands over to the scientists to speak. He just opens the gate, as it were. He doesn't claim to be a self-appointed spokesperson, and I think actually somebody like DiCaprio, just because we listen to him, because he's glamorous, because he's famous, because he's an actor, can really raise awareness in very, very positive ways. And I think if anybody does it well, I think he does it exceptionally well without the political divisiveness of an Al Gore.
Thank you. Has anyone else got a role model? Phil?
Well, not that I've had much contact with her, but I found Caroline Lucas inspirational, actually. And she couldn't come to our college recently, but she sent her deputy, who was also, they're now sharing the role, and he was also great. So she would be my role model at the moment.
Anyone else? Maya, you got one? Anyone comes to mind, or?
Not really.
No. Andrew bursting.
Yeah, well, because funnily enough, because I brought in DiCaprio and George Marshall's critique of him, but there's lots of interesting differences of opinion here. But I've written a lot, and because I've done consultancy with political leaders, including Obama actually, I've written a lot about the good enough leader. And a good enough leader, like a good enough parent, is one who can manage disappointment, and that means accept failure. And unfortunately, in Western political discourse, it's very difficult to set up a situation in which a leader can talk about failure. So if we're talking about message, which is one of the things I was trying to talk about when I brought in about language, if we're talking about message, we need to find a message that is crafted so as to embrace the possibility of failure, or perhaps to dispute the binary between success and failure, hence good enough, which is an import from psychoanalysis. So that's my answer to that question. But it is quite funny that DiCaprio is your man, and George Marshall went to town criticising the use of celebrities in relation to climate change activism.
Thank you very much.
Bye.